What if the difference between life and death in the skies of World War II came down to a tiny metal washer, one that cost less than 50 cents? Picture the summer of 1940. The Battle of Britain is raging, and the fate of the nation literally hangs in the air. British Spitfires are outnumbered, but fast, elegant, and fiercely maneuverable. Pilots trust them with their lives until a shocking flaw emerges. In the middle of a dogfight, one move could turn the plane's greatest strength into a death trap. Dive too sharply, and the Spitfire's powerful Merlin engine would choke, sputter, and die. In a war where every second mattered, that flaw could be fatal. It was a problem the Royal Air Force couldn't solve fast enough. Dozens of brilliant engineers had studied the issue, but nothing worked. The Germans' Messerschmitt Bf-109s, powered by advanced fuel injection systems, had no such issue. They could dive at will, forcing British pilots to stay on the defensive. The Spitfire, the pride of the skies, was suddenly flying with one hand tied behind its back. Then came a woman few had ever heard of. Her name was Beatrice Tilly Shilling, a motorcycle racer, engineer, and one of the very few women working in the male-dominated world of wartime aeronautics. She didn't wear a uniform or fly a plane, but her tiny invention, a simple metal washer barely the size of a coin, would soon rewrite the odds of air combat. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't expensive, but it would go on to save over 2,000 pilots' lives. This is the story of how one woman's 50-cent fix made Spitfires outfly every Bf-109 in the sky, and how her idea changed the course of history. At first, the Spitfire seemed unstoppable. Sleek, fast, and agile, it became a symbol of British resistance. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine purred like a cat until the pilot slammed the stick forward. Then, in a heartbeat, the power would vanish. The problem lay deep in the engine's heart, the carburetor. While the German Bf-109 used advanced fuel injection, delivering fuel precisely under pressure, the Merlin relied on gravity-fed carburetors. In a steep dive, gravity suddenly worked against it, flooding the engine with excess fuel and starving it of air. The result? The engine cut out completely. Pilots had to level out and wait precious seconds for it to restart, often while an enemy fighter screamed down at them, guns blazing. To a pilot, that flaw was more than mechanical. It was personal. Many described the helpless moment when their engine died mid-dive as pure terror. The plane that once symbolized freedom could suddenly feel like a coffin. Engineers at Rolls-Royce scrambled for answers. They tested restrictor valves, new carburetor designs, anything that could fix the imbalance. But every attempt either made the problem worse or slowed performance elsewhere. The RAF needed a miracle, something that could be installed quickly, cheaply, and safely on every Spitfire in the fleet. And in the middle of that frantic search, tucked away at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, an unassuming engineer named Beatrice Shilling quietly listened, took notes, and decided to take matters into her own hands. She didn't care about hierarchy or procedure. She saw a problem, and she wanted it solved. And the idea she came up with next, so simple it looked almost laughable, would change everything. But how could a small washer fix an entire warplane's engine? That's what we'll uncover next, because once you understand what she built, you'll never look at simple fixes the same way again. Beatrice Tilly Shilling didn't exactly fit the image of a wartime engineer. In the 1930s and 40s, Britain's aircraft industry was dominated by men in lab coats and military uniforms buried in blueprints and equations. Tilly, on the other hand, was a speed addict. Before the war, she tore down British racetracks on a supercharged motorcycle she'd modified herself. hitting speeds that left professional riders speechless. She wasn't just fast, she was fearless. By the time the war broke out, Tilly had already built a reputation for being the woman who could fix what no one else dared to touch. She earned an engineering degree from the University of Manchester, an extraordinary achievement for a woman in the 1920s, and soon joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAE, at Farnborough. There, she specialized in engine performance, testing carburetors, fuel systems, and anything that could squeeze more power out of the RAF's aircraft. But the RAE wasn't exactly welcoming to women. She was one of only a handful of female engineers, and she often had to work twice as hard just to be taken seriously. When male colleagues dismissed her ideas, she shrugged, rolled up her sleeves, and let the results speak for themselves. When word spread that the Spitfire's Merlin engines were cutting out during dives, Tilly immediately zeroed in on the culprit, the carburetor's float chamber. She knew the physics behind it. Under negative G-forces, the fuel surged forward, flooding the system and choking the engine. The solution had to control fuel flow without redesigning the entire carburetor, which would take months the RAF didn't have. That's when she had her flash of inspiration. While other engineers proposed complex mechanical overhauls, Tilly thought small. She realized that what the Merlin needed wasn't a new design, just a simple restriction in the right place. Something to limit how much fuel could surge forward under pressure without starving the engine entirely. It was an idea so straightforward, it almost felt like cheating. A metal washer, a tiny circular disc with a hole precisely measured to let the right amount of fuel through. It didn't block anything. It simply kept the fuel in check during those gut-wrenching dives. Tilly began sketching the concept, ran calculations by hand, and soon had a working prototype cut from a piece of brass. When she showed it to her colleagues, some laughed. "A washer? That's it?" But she insisted. It wasn't about complexity, it was about control. And when the test engines roared to life with her little modification, something remarkable happened. The Merlin didn't choke, it didn't sputter, it just kept running. Perfectly smooth, even during simulated dives. Tilly had just cracked one of the most frustrating problems in British aviation. But the real test wouldn't happen in the lab. It would happen in the sky, with real pilots, real bullets, and no second chances. And when she brought her invention to the airfields, no one could have predicted how it would change everything, or how many lives it would save. The day Tilly Shilling carried her strange little invention to the test airfield, few people took her seriously. After all, the Spitfire's fuel issue had stumped some of the brightest engineers in the country. And here was this woman, standing with a tiny brass disc barely the size of a coin, claiming it could fix the problem that no one else could. The part would later become famous, and earn an unforgettably cheeky nickname from the pilots who used it, Miss Shilling's Orifice. It was nothing more than a precisely machined washer fitted into the Merlin engine's carburetor to regulate fuel flow under negative G-forces. Simple? Yes. But that simplicity was its genius. When the Spitfire's engine dove nose down, gravity would force excess fuel forward, flooding the carburetor and killing the engine. Tilly's washer limited that surge by narrowing the path, just enough to keep the fuel where it needed to be. It didn't require major redesigns, new tooling, or complicated installations. Mechanics could fit it in minutes, right on the airfield. At first, some of the men at the Royal Aircraft Establishment smirked. It looked like a child's science project, but when the test results came back, the laughter stopped. In controlled dives, engines fitted with Tilly's washer kept running smoothly, even under extreme G-forces. The difference was immediate and revolutionary. When Tilly personally visited squadrons to oversee installations, pilots were skeptical. Many had lost friends to that sudden engine cutout, and they didn't believe a 50-cent fix could make their Spitfires combat-ready again. But Tilly didn't come just to explain. She came to prove it. She'd hop into a test plane herself, riding shotgun while pilots put her invention through its paces. She was calm, confident, and absolutely certain of her math. And when the pilots pulled their planes into sharp dives and tight rolls, waiting for that familiar engine stutter that never came, they knew instantly that something extraordinary had happened. For the first time, they could chase the enemy down through a dive without fear of losing power. Tilly's little washer turned the Spitfire into a true equal, or even a superior, to the German Bf-109. The British fighters could finally match the enemy plane's aggressive dive tactics, turning what had once been a crippling disadvantage into a strength. Soon, news of the miracle fix spread across the RAF. Mechanics began fitting washers to every Spitfire and Hurricane they could get their hands on. It was quick, cheap, and astonishingly effective. The airfields buzzed with a new kind of energy. Pilots who had once flown with hesitation now soared with confidence. Miss Shilling's Orifice wasn't just an engineering solution. It was a morale booster. It gave the RAF its swagger back. But there was still a problem. Britain was in the middle of an all-out air war, and the RAF's fleet stretched across countless bases. Installing the washer on every aircraft wouldn't be easy, and time was running out, because while the RAF was fitting their planes with Tilly's invention, the Luftwaffe wasn't standing still, and their next move would test everything the British engineers had built. The difference was immediate and undeniable. Before Tilly's invention, German Bf-109 pilots had a deadly advantage. They could dive hard, fast, and steep without their engines missing a beat. Spitfire pilots, on the other hand, had to hold back. If they tried to follow a German fighter into a sharp dive, their Merlin engines would choke, sputter, and cut out completely. By the time they leveled out, their opponent was long gone. But once Miss Shilling's Orifice was installed, that dynamic changed overnight. For the first time, Spitfire pilots could follow the enemy down, maintaining power all the way through the dive. They no longer had to hesitate. The skies that had once felt like a death trap suddenly became a place of confidence and control. In the words of one RAF pilot, "Before, a dive was a gamble. After Miss Shilling, it was a weapon." During the height of the Battle of Britain, that mattered more than anything. The Luftwaffe's main tactic, hit-and-run dives, began to lose its edge. German pilots, used to seeing the Spitfires break off their pursuit, were suddenly finding British fighters right behind them, matching every move. Dogfights that had once ended in escape now ended in flames. The engineers at Rolls-Royce couldn't believe it. A simple brass disc had done what months of research hadn't. And the best part? The fix didn't slow production, didn't require new engines, and could be installed in the field in under an hour. It was estimated that by the end of 1941, thousands of Spitfires and Hurricanes had been fitted with Tilly's washer. In just a few months, the RAF had turned a crippling weakness into a lethal advantage. And it wasn't just about combat effectiveness, it was about morale. Pilots talked about the washer as if it were a lucky charm. They'd joke about Tilly's magic fix, even scrawling her name onto the noses of their planes. She wasn't a general, she wasn't a commander, yet she had done something no strategist could. She gave them their confidence back. In the middle of war, that confidence was priceless. RAF losses began to drop. Fewer engines failed in combat. Pilots who might have died in powerless dives came home instead. The numbers told the story. Over 2,000 pilots credited their survival to Tilly's simple innovation. But Tilly didn't stop there. She didn't just design the fix. She personally drove across Britain, visiting airfields in her motorcycle with a box of washers strapped to the back. She'd show up, sleeves rolled up, install the part herself, and move on to the next base. Rain, snow, mud, none of it mattered. She was on a mission, and yet, even as her invention changed the skies, not everyone appreciated what she'd done. Some dismissed her work as a temporary patch. Others refused to give her credit at all. But Tilly didn't care about credit. She cared about results. And she knew that her fix, however simple, was keeping young men alive. Still, as the war escalated and the RAF expanded, a new challenge appeared, one that would test how far her little invention could go and how long it could hold the line before technology caught up. Once word of Tilly Shilling's fix spread through the Royal Air Force, a new kind of urgency took over. The Spitfire squadrons needed the washer, now. But Britain was in the middle of an air war, and production lines were already stretched to breaking point. There were no neat distribution networks or orderly factories ready to mass-produce the tiny brass disc. The country's industrial focus was on engines, weapons, and airframes, not a coin-sized piece of metal. Yet every pilot wanted one, and every mechanic was begging headquarters to send them faster. So Tilly did what she always did. She refused to wait for bureaucracy. She loaded up her motorcycle, a stripped-down, roaring machine she'd tuned herself, and began what pilots would later call the Shilling Run. She packed boxes of her washers in a leather satchel, strapped them to the back seat, and tore across Britain at full throttle. Airfield to airfield, from the south coast to the Scottish Highlands, she arrived in her oil-stained flight suit, goggles down, and a grin that said she had work to do. At each base, she'd park, walk straight into the hangar, and start fitting the part herself. Mechanics who doubted her quickly changed their tune once they saw her work. She moved fast, explaining the principle, showing them how to install it, and making sure every Merlin engine she touched was ready for the next dogfight. Within weeks, hundreds of aircraft were fitted. Within months, thousands. Word spread like wildfire. If Tilly's been here, your Spitfires won't choke again. But it wasn't easy. Britain was under constant bombardment. Airfields were being hit, supply lines were strained, and fuel and materials were scarce. Finding the precise metal stock to machine, the washers sometimes meant scavenging from scrap bins or improvising with whatever the workshops could spare. Still, Tilly's energy was relentless. Colleagues joked that she was powered by the same fuel that drove the Spitfires, unlimited determination. The RAF began issuing standardized versions of her design, rolling them out across every frontline squadron. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The simplicity of her invention was its greatest strength. No moving parts, no maintenance, and virtually no failure rate. By 1941, the Orifice, as the pilots cheekily called it, was as standard as a propeller blade. Mechanics who once laughed at the idea were now fitting them by instinct. In mess halls, pilots raised toasts to Miss Shilling, even though most had never met her. Yet behind the triumph, there was quiet tension. Rolls-Royce was working on a long-term solution, a pressure carburetor that would eventually eliminate the need for Tilly's washer altogether. Some engineers saw her fix as a stopgap, a clever bandage until real technology arrived. Tilly didn't argue. She knew that the permanent solutions might come eventually, but her job was saving lives now. And every week that her little brass washer stayed in the sky, another pilot made it home. The RAF had its edge back, but fame never sat easily with Tilly. She preferred engines to applause. Still, her name was whispered across the hangars with genuine affection and awe. Yet even as Britain's planes roared with new confidence, Tilly's story was already being rewritten, buried under reports, rival claims, and the chaos of war. And the truth about her legacy would become as contested as the skies she helped defend. For all her brilliance, Beatrice Tilly Shilling never became a household name. Her invention saved lives, changed battles, and gave the RAF a fighting chance. Yet her story was almost lost in the noise of war. Part of that was timing. Britain was fighting for survival, and victory took precedence over individual glory. The men who flew the planes were celebrated as heroes, and rightly so. But the engineers behind those victories, especially the women, rarely made headlines. Still, among pilots and mechanics, whispers spread. They called her the woman who fixed the Spitfire, and her visits to the airfields became the stuff of legend. She'd roll up on her motorcycle, stride through mud and snow, and get straight to work. No ceremony, no salute, just focus. Pilots adored her for it. Mechanics respected her. But in the upper echelons of the Air Ministry, not everyone was eager to spotlight a female engineer. Behind the scenes, there were also rivalries. Some senior engineers, mostly men, downplayed her contribution, describing her washer as a temporary measure. They preferred to highlight the later development of pressure carburetors, which eventually solved the fuel flow problem permanently. Others went even further, suggesting that Tilly's device was merely a field adjustment, as if she had stumbled upon it by luck, not design. But the pilots knew better. So did the mechanics who watched her work. She wasn't guessing. She was calculating. Every millimeter of that orifice had been designed for precision. Then came the rumors, stories that blurred the line between fact and legend. Some claimed that when the RAF command was slow to authorize her fix, Tilly defied orders and installed it herself. Others said she personally argued with senior officers who doubted her math, and that she won every time. Whether or not those stories were true, they captured her spirit perfectly. Despite the dismissals, the impact of her invention was undeniable. When she was awarded the Order of the British Empire, OBE, for her wartime service, it was a quiet ceremony, no headlines, no fanfare. Yet, for those who knew her story, it was more than deserved. After the war, Tilly continued to break barriers. She stayed at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, contributing to post-war jet research and mentoring young engineers. She raced motorcycles well into her 50s, still beating the men who underestimated her. But history has a way of burying its unsung heroes under layers of newer stories. As jet engines replaced carburetors and newer wars reshaped the world, her name faded from public memory. The washer that had once symbolized ingenuity and courage became a footnote in engineering textbooks, an interim solution mentioned in passing. Only decades later did historians begin to rediscover her story, piecing together how one woman's invention may have saved over 2,000 pilots during the war. What had once been dismissed as just a washer turned out to be one of the most impactful engineering solutions of its time. Tilly never sought fame. She didn't need monuments or medals. Her reward was knowing that her idea worked and that it kept people alive. But the deeper you look into her story, the clearer it becomes. Tilly Shilling wasn't just a problem solver. She was a rule breaker. And her legacy went far beyond a single piece of metal. When the war finally ended, the world looked very different, and so did the skies. The roar of piston engines was being replaced by the piercing scream of jet turbines. The days of the carburetor were numbered, but even as new technologies took over, the legacy of Tilly Shilling's tiny brass washer refused to fade, because what she created wasn't just a mechanical fix, it was a symbol. It proved that sometimes the most powerful innovations aren't born in boardrooms or laboratories, but in the hands of someone willing to think differently. Tilly had seen a problem that everyone else accepted as unsolvable and solved it with nothing more than logic, precision, and a stubborn refusal to quit. Her approach became a model for what engineers would later call elegant simplicity. Instead of adding complexity to fix a problem, she stripped it down to its essence. No over-engineering, no unnecessary redesigns, just a perfect balance between function and practicality. It's the same principle that drives everything from spacecraft design to smartphone engineering today. Make it simple, make it reliable, and make it work. But the deeper impact of her story wasn't just technical. It was cultural. At a time when women in engineering were almost invisible, Tilly stood as living proof that brilliance had no gender. She didn't campaign for recognition, she earned it, one solved problem at a time. For younger women who followed her into the field, her story became an unspoken beacon. If she could do it in the 1940s, they could do it too. In engineering schools and aviation circles, her solution is still studied as a masterclass in design thinking. The Miss Shilling's Orifice remains a case study in how small tweaks can have massive consequences, how a single modification can shift the balance of an entire system. Even outside the world of flight, her washer became a metaphor. Leaders, inventors, and innovators across industries referenced it when talking about how a small, clever fix could change everything. It's the kind of story that sticks because it feels almost impossible, that something so trivial could have such monumental results. And perhaps that's why her legacy endures, because it reminds us that war isn't only won by soldiers and planes, it's also won by the people who think. Tilly never saw herself as a hero. She once joked that she just didn't like engines misbehaving. But her quiet genius reshaped an entire branch of aeronautics. The same mind that tinkered with motorcycles for fun ended up outsmarting the Luftwaffe, one washer at a time. By the time the RAF retired its last carburetted fighters, her name had already become legend among the old pilots who remembered what flying was like before she came along. To them, her invention wasn't a piece of metal. It was a lifeline. But history has a way of forgetting the quiet heroes until someone digs deep enough to find the story buried beneath the noise. And what they find isn't just about one woman or one war, but a truth that still defines innovation today. Greatness often hides in the smallest details. The war may have ended, but the shockwaves of Tilly Shilling's invention continued to spread long after the skies fell silent. Her 50-cent metal washer had done more than save pilots. It had changed how engineers thought about problem-solving itself. When post-war engineers studied her work, they realized that her approach, fast, practical, and ruthlessly efficient, was exactly what the new world demanded. The age of sprawling, complex designs was over. The new era favored solutions that were lean, reliable, and field-ready. In many ways, Tilly's washer was a blueprint for modern engineering culture. Fix it simply, fix it fast, fix it right. The principle carried far beyond aviation. During the early days of the jet age, engineers began designing systems with fail-safes, small, inexpensive components meant to prevent catastrophic failure under stress. The logic behind those safety features traced back to the same idea that drove Tilly's thinking. One tiny change could decide whether something failed or survived. Even in today's world of cutting-edge technology, the lesson still rings true. Every time a spacecraft launches with redundant systems, or a smartphone uses a pressure valve to prevent overheating, There's a little bit of Tilly Shilling's philosophy at work. Small components, massive consequences, but perhaps her greatest ripple wasn't mechanical. It was human. Tilly didn't just fix engines, she cracked open a door that had been closed to women for decades. During the war, thousands of women entered factories, labs, and design offices, building the planes, ships, and machines that powered victory. But when peace returned, many were told to step aside and let the men work again. Tilly didn't step aside. She stayed. She built her career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, earned her OBE, and mentored young women entering engineering. Her presence alone challenged the unspoken rule that technical genius was a man's domain. To her colleagues, she wasn't a token figure. She was the real deal, the person who'd saved the Spitfire when no one else could. Her influence lingered quietly in the halls of Farnborough, in university lecture notes, and in the minds of the next generation of engineers who admired her nerve. She taught by example that good ideas didn't need permission. They just needed proof. And proof, in her case, was written in the contrails above the English Channel. Years later, pilots who survived because of her washer would meet at reunions and retell the story. Not of medals or glory, but of a small brass disc, and the woman who delivered it on a motorcycle, racing across bombed-out roads to keep them alive. Some historians have estimated that her innovation saved over 2,000 RAF pilots during the war. That's not just a number. That's 2,000 men who made it home, 2,000 families who didn't lose someone to the clouds. It's easy to measure victory in machines or missions. Harder to see it in the unseen, the small, precise idea that made the difference when everything else was falling apart. And that's the real heart of Tilly Shilling's story. It's not just about the washer that saved the Spitfire. It's about how one mind, determined, overlooked, and underestimated, quietly changed the course of a world war with a tool smaller than her palm. But even as her legacy grew among those who remembered her, the world moved on until historians started to rediscover her, piecing together the forgotten tale of how one woman's courage and curiosity helped shape the future of flight. Behind the legendary engineering feat was a woman who lived far more quietly than her contribution to history might suggest. Beatrice, Tilly Shilling, wasn't seeking fame. She was drawn to engines and precision, to the challenge of solving problems that seemed impossible. Friends and colleagues remembered her as fiercely intelligent, stubborn, and endlessly curious. She had a wry sense of humor, often teasing pilots who gawked at her as she arrived at the airfield in oil-streaked overalls. "If the engine's like me," she'd say with a grin, "they'll do what I tell them." Her life wasn't defined by glamour or accolades. She never married, never sought social approval, and found satisfaction in doing her job exceptionally well. For her, the joy came from understanding a system, identifying the flaw, and crafting a solution that worked perfectly, whether it was a fighter plane in the Battle of Britain or a test-bed engine at Farnborough. Yet there were human costs. The war demanded long hours, intense focus, and travel to airfields in dangerous conditions. Tilly rode through rain, mud, and even occasional bombed-out roads to make sure her invention reached every squadron. She risked her own safety for a mission she felt was worth more than recognition. Despite these pressures, she remained deeply respected by those who knew her. Pilots referred to her affectionately as Miss Shilling, and stories of her determination became the sort of legends that pilots would recount in mess halls and reunions. Mechanics spoke of her as someone whose presence alone could inspire confidence. After the war, she continued working in aviation, contributing to jet research and mentoring new generations of engineers. Her modesty never waned. She never allowed herself to be overshadowed by pride or claim credit over the thousands of lives her innovation helped protect. But history sometimes forgets the quiet heroes. While air battles and decorated pilots filled newspapers, Tilly's contributions remained largely unknown to the public. Only later, through historians' diligence and the memories of surviving pilots, did her story re-emerge, proving that one person's brilliance, even if overlooked at the time, can ripple across generations. Her story resonates today because it's more than an engineering feat. It's a testament to persistence, courage, and the profound impact a single, determined individual can have in moments of crisis. It's a reminder that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it rides on a motorcycle, carrying a tiny brass washer that changes the world. The question lingers. How many other Tilly Shillings have been lost to history? Brilliant minds who quietly reshaped the world while the spotlight focused elsewhere? Tilly Shilling's story doesn't end with the war. It lives on in the planes that once roared across the skies, in engineering classrooms, and in the quiet lessons of innovation that her life continues to teach. A tiny washer, no larger than a coin, changed the course of aerial combat, and in doing so saved over 2,100 pilots. But the real impact wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural and human. Her life illustrates that true genius often hides in the overlooked details. While generals planned strategies and engineers designed massive machines, it was a small, precise adjustment, one woman's idea, that turned the tide in crucial moments. The lesson is timeless. A single insight, applied at the right time, can ripple outward and save countless lives. Her story also challenges the narratives we tell about heroism. Pilots are remembered for bravery in the sky, but Tilly proved that courage can also be measured by quiet determination in a workshop, by standing firm when others doubt you, and by working relentlessly to solve a problem no one else has solved. Heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's meticulous, patient, and persistent. Tilly's legacy continues in modern engineering. Her emphasis on elegant simplicity, practicality, and precise problem-solving is echoed in everything from aerospace design to safety systems in everyday technology. Young engineers, particularly women entering historically male-dominated fields, look to her story as proof that ability, persistence, and ingenuity matter more than recognition or approval. Yet perhaps the most striking lesson is this. History often overlooks those who work quietly behind the scenes. Tilly didn't seek fame or headlines, but her actions mattered far more than those who did. The tiny washer she designed, carried across bombed-out roads and fitted with her own hands, became a lifeline. It reminds us that small actions, grounded in skill and courage, can shape the course of events in ways that even the largest strategies cannot. Her name may have faded from public memory for decades, but her impact remains undeniable. For every Spitfire that soared above the English Channel, for every pilot who returned safely because of her invention, and for every engineer inspired by her example, Tilly Shilling's story is a testament to the profound power of intellect, determination, and courage. In the end, it wasn't just a washer that saved the Spitfire. It was a woman's mind, racing against time, solving a problem everyone else thought impossible. And in that, Tilly Shilling became immortal, not in headlines, but in the lives she preserved and the legacy she quietly left behind.